So what happens if we're not at our long run equilibrium? So let's think about this. In those scenarios that we saw, if our current GDP is either above or below the potential, we said that our goal is to be at our potential. So we need to figure out some way to get it back to our long run equilibrium, to the point where all three of those are intersecting. So the way in order to do that, we have to either get our GDP to increase or we got to get it to decrease. So let's think about how we would get that done. If we think back to our formula for real GDP, it's equal to Y is equal to C plus I plus G plus X sub N, or net exports. So if we think about this like a basic math equation, if we want that Y, that left side of the equation, to either increase or decrease, we got to get either C or I or G or net exports to increase or decrease, right? Like if Y is to increase, we need one of the other ones to increase. Or if Y is to decrease, we need something on the right-hand side to decrease. So how do we change the Y? So what we end up seeing is that there's actually specific actions that can be taken by either the government through Congress or through the Federal Reserve, the National Bank of the United States. And we refer to these as different types of policies. So we see that we have fiscal policy that can be implemented by the government, or monetary policy implemented by the Federal Reserve. Today we're going to talk about fiscal policy, and in 6.3 we're going to cover monetary policy. So fiscal policy is any action that we see of Congress in order to try to influence the real GDP. So what does Congress have the power over? Well, really, they have power to influence consumer spending and government spending. And what exactly does the Federal Reserve have power over? Well, they have the power to influence investment spending and consumer spending. Now, we're not saying necessarily that like the Federal Reserve Bank can force people to spend more money on consumption or force businesses to invest more, but they do have the tools to try to influence that. And same is true for the government. So if we see that any of these changes happen, right, to the G or the C or to the I of our formula, those are all determinants of our aggregate demand curve. If you remember from 6.1, we said any of those four things that are in our GDP equation, any of those four things changing, well, that will shift our aggregate demand curve. So we see that if any of these actions are taken, it can shift our aggregate demand curve. And here's the thing. If we do it correctly, it can move our aggregate demand curve back to a point where it's intersecting with our short-run aggregate supply curve and our long-run aggregate supply curve. So let's take a look at what this might look like. Suppose that we're in a recession and we have a recessionary gap. So what exactly is the problem? Well, again, we're below our potential. Our unemployment rate is high because our GDP is low. We're experiencing a recession. So what can be done about it? Well, like we said, we have those few determinants of aggregate demand. Maybe it's increasing consumer spending, increasing government spending, or increasing investment spending. And what we're going to see is, because those are all determinants of our aggregate demand curve, if any of those three increases, it's going to increase our aggregate demand. It's going to shift our aggregate demand curve to the right. And what we see is, if it's done correctly, it'll shift our aggregate demand curve to the right enough to get to a point where, once again, our aggregate demand curve is intersecting with our long run and our short run aggregate supply curves. And so what will come as a result? Well, we'll see that our GDP has increased to its potential. We'll see that hopefully the unemployment rate has lowered as well. But one of the consequences that we see is that our price levels might increase. We might experience inflation because, obviously, if our GDP increases, inflation moves in the same direction. Now, what about the other side? What if we're experiencing an expansionary gap? What if we're at that point where we're beyond our potential and we really kind of need to pump the brakes a little bit? So what's the problem? Well, again, we're above our potential. Prices are rising too fast. In experiencing this rapid expansion, again, we need to just slow down. We need to tell ourselves, hey, quit sprinting at the beginning of the marathon. Just slow down and come back to a more sustainable pace. So what are some actions that could be taken by the government? Well, they could influence things in order to decrease consumer spending or decrease government spending, or they could also influence things to decrease investment spending. And any of these three things decreasing would decrease or shift our aggregate demand curve back to the left. And so hopefully what we would see is that it shifts back to the left to a point where, once again, all three curves are intersecting. And what we would see as a result is that our GDP has decreased slightly to its potential, right? We've stepped on the brakes a little bit. We move our unemployment rate back to its natural rate, and price levels have stabilized. That's kind of the big one. And some people might look at this and they might say, hey, why would we want our GDP to stop growing as much? But like we said, it's that idea that we can't stay there forever. If we try to hang out at that point, it's going to have some long-term consequences. Like I said, if you take off sprinting at the start of the marathon, yeah, you might be in first place for a little bit, but you're going to end up puking on the side of the road a little bit later on.